College Football Nerds here talking Texas and Georgia. Really excited for this one. These were fun games last year, and it's a huge game in the SEC landscape this year. Got my nerd Josh with me. We're going to get nerdy with y'all. And Josh, first, this is not something we talk about a ton, but I think it's worth mentioning just because of how these teams have sort of been changing things, tweaking things, figuring themselves out throughout the year. Do you think it's significant that Texas had a bye week last week and Georgia was playing against a not great team, but a capable offense in Mississippi State?
It's probably significant. I mean, at some level, film prep and film review and studying scheme matters. Having 2 weeks to look at tape on Georgia, well, Georgia probably cheated a little bit, but Mississippi State is too dangerous for them to just ignore. Matters. But I'll also say, Daniel, there's something to be said that you get Arch Manning, who finally got in a rhythm and he's comfortable, and now he's sitting on the bench, sitting at practice, throwing against air, and you sometimes lose a little bit of rhythm of that, I think, compared to teams that are playing straight through. I think on the whole, it's definitely an advantage for Texas, but it's maybe there's an argument the other way too, that maintaining rhythm is also important.
So the other thing that I think is interesting to me is Texas this year. A lot is made of Arch and his performance against Ohio State early in the year, and I think that you can throw that out equally for both offenses in that game because they both looked a lot better since that game. We talk about first start on the road against a good team or against any team that has good athletes. Same reason we're kind of throwing out the Alabama-Florida State result if you prove yourself to be better after that. And I think Texas has. However, are we in some ways falling for recency bias in a 34-31 win versus Vanderbilt for a Texas team that say, okay, we'll throw out the Ohio State game? Well, there's still the Florida game. There's still the overtime against Kentucky game, overtime against Mississippi State game, close game against a good Vanderbilt team. Is it fair to say that we might be putting maybe too much weight on 23-6 versus Oklahoma, and that in some ways Texas is not as good as we think, or is it a little bit more, and this is probably what you're going to say, a lot more nuanced than that?
Well, I mean, I'm glad that you want to make sure Texas fans hate us right out of the gate, Daniel. 'Cause, I mean, we certainly with Twitter, we it's always positivity every day in the modern world of social media. Oklahoma, they thumped Oklahoma pretty good. And now the flip side of that, Amatir was terrible, just objectively bad. And it wasn't a broken finger thing. I mean, he's ripping the ball, as you've pointed out a lot, on a spiral right into a defender's chest. He's played bad in that game, and he's kind of played bad off and on since. But to your point, Kentucky, Mississippi State, and Vanderbilt are probably the three worst defenses in the SEC. I can pull it up in terms of overall yard per play defense here. It's not going to shock me if it's those three in Arkansas. It is Kentucky's 11th, and then Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, Arkansas. But I think Kentucky's substantially worse than Tennessee. I think that's a product of schedule, who's 12. So, I mean, you're dealing with probably three of the four worst defenses in the conference. At some level, recency bias is a thing, Daniel. And to your point, one of those games, Kentucky was 16-13, and that is not a good defense. Mississippi State and Vanderbilt are two of the three worst defenses. Vanderbilt has been excellent and is ranked high because offensively, they are the highest points per drive offense in the country. They average 3.74 points per drive. That is number one in the country ahead of Indiana, who's second, and USC, who's third. Defensively, Vanderbilt gives up 2.27 points per drive, which is 71st in the country. They are just an objectively bad defense. And you can say the same thing certainly for Mississippi State. They're 47th in the country, and that's even actually without a particularly hard schedule. They've been giving up a ton of points. And so I do think there's a real question of how much is Texas, how much is scheduling. I mean, we just saw Vanderbilt play Auburn, and they gave up a lot of passing yards in offensive production to an Auburn team whose offense has just straight sucked for most of the year. Vanderbilt through the season has had to win by win by outscoring teams. I think both versus Auburn and Texas, it's an interesting anecdote that in our system, Auburn is the number one rush defense in the country and Texas is number three. I think Vanderbilt ran into a bit of a buzzsaw with both teams early on trying to run their scheme. It didn't work. And then both games they transitioned to throwing late. Versus Auburn, it was enough to come back. Texas, they probably did it too late. I think that probably is a bit of an indictment, frankly, on Vanderbilt's coaching staff that they didn't see that coming and make the adjustment earlier or even come in with a better game plan. But I kind of digress. What I will say, Daniel, is I think Arch Manning is turned into the guy that we thought he was. And maybe we can throw this tweet up, but way back in 2022, we looked at his tape, and we were some of the people that said, hey, we don't get him being the number one quarterback in the country. But in the same breath, we also said, I think he's a top 50 quarterback. Like, I have always felt like he was a high-level four-star. I thought the hype was unwarranted, being the best player ever, tied for certain rating systems as the highest-rated recruit ever, was unwarranted. I think everybody at this point sort of accepted that's not who he is. But I also looked at him and go, he's also a really tall, big-armed quarterback with a lot of potential and good mobility. He is a good quarterback. He is a good quarterback. Maybe he becomes a first-round quarterback and has a similar trajectory to like Ty Simpson, who, granted, Manning's not actually that much younger. And I'm curious what you think on this. I think we've seen Manning turn around, and I think the big thing to me in these games is, even if you want to say these are inferior defenses, I also didn't see Manning throwing the ball in the dirt. Like the Florida game and some of those earlier games, they'd have guys wide open and they just airmail it, throw it in the dirt, miss the throw, not see it. Manning has operated the offense at a high level. They're not throwing many incompletions. He's completing the easy passes. He's giving them a chance with good ball placement on a screen that goes for 75 yards. At least it was executed well, and that's something they weren't doing earlier. And given the talent that surrounds them at Texas, I think that level of competence, which is all you need to have, and probably even above average at this point, is enough to make them a really dangerous football team.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that tweet because a lot of the hate that we catch on Twitter about the nerds hating Texas started with that. And that's the frustrating thing I have about, social media and hot take stuff. Like, we try very hard to be objective about things, but we live in a space where you have to glaze to get a following, and that's probably definitely stunted our following. We're honest and objective about things, and then it's called hate. And even after it proves to be true, the original perception that we hate because we didn't say the thing you wanted to hear ended up being true, but we don't get credit retroactively for actually, oh, by the way, they didn't hate us, they were right. And when you say top 50 quarterback, what you said in the thread was overall top 50 player, not the 50th best quarterback in that class. And I think that's fair. Like, I think he was the chasm between high 4-star and greatest recruit of all time is massive. And we were just looking around saying the bar for greatest, highest rated recruit of all time is very high. And there's no way he's meeting that with a different last name.
It's Cam Newton, Bryce Young. I mean, that's what we said in the thread is I don't see Bryce Young's creativity and sort of ability to create magic. And I don't see Cam Newton as an athlete. What I see is a guy that has a lot of really good traits and seems to have a good pedigree and understanding of the game, but also when he played better competition, sometimes struggled with the speed of the game in high school, which is still a very good quarterback. But as you said, the chasm between very good quarterback and Cam Newton is huge.
Yeah, and by the way, we had our own takes about Bryce Young as he progressed through Alabama that pissed off Alabama fans too, and ended up saying he wasn't worthy of where he went drafted.
So. I mean, there's still Ohio State fans that talk about how we always said Bryce Young was better than C.J. Stroud, which is hilarious because the whole last year of Bryce's tenure at Alabama, we kept saying that we thought it was nuts that everyone wanted to draft Young ahead of Stroud, and we both strongly felt like Stroud should have been the number one pick that year. But as you said, we'll stop whining about it, but it is annoying how those gripes at the time, even when they're right, they stick, and people don't really either one realize, okay, well, in retrospect they were correct, or two, there's no real memory of what actually got said and how opinions evolved and all that kind of thing.
Okay, so one other quick note I will say, what is really interesting about the Vanderbilt game is 2 years in a row, Texas has beaten Vanderbilt soundly. Vanderbilt comes at the very end and puts a couple of scores on. kicks an onside kick, doesn't get it, and it looks like a really close game. That game was not that close. I know that Vanderbilt had a chance to get an onside kick and maybe tie that game. They were down 34-16 in the fourth quarter. It was just uncanny how 2 years in a row that game played out. And also, Georgia fans, and I'm going to transition to Georgia on this, but also give Texas a little bit of credit. The Florida team that Georgia and Texas played, especially the Florida defense, much better team when they cared about who they were playing. People are going to retroactively look at the Kentucky game and say, "Oh, look, see, like Florida sucks." No, that's a team full of athletes. I give them a lot of credit. Florida was up for those games, but shifting to Georgia, it's tough for me to really pin them down because it seems like Georgia is playing a little bit of in a tight game with whoever they're playing, mirroring their style. And to kind of put a finer point on it, Auburn 20-10, right? Auburn has a good defense, really trash offense. Georgia played good defense, especially in the second half. Didn't play great offense. Ole Miss, trash defense, really good offense. So that game was 45-35. Florida kind of just ugly defensive struggle. Florida's an ugly defensive struggle kind of team. Same thing with Tennessee, 44-41. So it seems like you can look at this as either a good thing or a bad thing. Georgia can scale up or down who they are from an identity standpoint to meet you at your strength. But it also means that they don't scale up the thing that you're not great at consistently. And so I'm just curious what you think about how it seems like kind of like Alabama in that if you're a decent team, decent plus, Georgia's not going to blow you out like they used to. They're going to find a way to make everybody just nervous and hand wring the entire game. And I wonder if it is kind of just where we are as football or if it's something specific to Georgia.
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, there's always nuance. One of the more fascinating things to me about this particular matchup, when you talk about points per drive, Daniel, Georgia's ninth in the country, or going, I think, into last week, was ninth in the country in offensive points per drive, 3.3, but 48th in the country defensive points allowed. Texas is almost the exact mirror opposite. Defensively, they are currently sitting at 10th in the country at points per drive allowed, but they're 56th in offensive points scored. And anytime you're good on one side or bad on the other, we've talked about this a ton, right? It tends to cause you to be in a lot of close games because Georgia defensively is just not great. A couple of weeks ago in the Florida game, I mean, they lose Kyron Jones for a bit. They lose Ja'Cory Thomas at safety. They still, we talked about in the Alabama preview a few weeks ago, and again, in the realm of us being Georgia haters, everybody was mad because we said we thought the secondary, or I said I thought the secondary had real personnel issues, especially on that side. I think I've been completely proven right that the side with Robinson and Denver Harris rotating at corner, matched with Kyron Jones in the back end and Aguero, is just, by Georgia standards, is really not the personnel they're used to. And they don't quite have the same pass rush they've used to either. They can generate it artificially, but they can't quite generate it with four in the way they have in some of their prior teams with some elite defensive lines. And that's led to a defense that, from a lot of statistical perspectives, is pretty average. And Daniel, I think that's why these games get the way they do. Because, you talk about, Auburn, for example. I mean, Auburn defensively is very good, especially against the run. Number one rated rush defense in our system. They're very good. I mean, Ole Miss is good defensively, but not that good. Florida is very good defensively. Those games, Auburn and Florida being low scoring, are not shocking for Georgia. The problem is defensively, giving up 20 to Florida is tough because Florida's offense is not very good. Auburn even giving up 10. They got run on a lot early in the game, which was what was so shocking, is what's tough. Tennessee giving up 41 points. I mean, even though the game went extra, it all comes down to me, Daniel, to the fact that Georgia's defense is not good enough to put teams away or to shut them down, so that Alabama this past week won 20-6, or 20-9, one or the other, I don't even remember, 20-9. Alabama's offense stalled against LSU's defense, and LSU's defense this year has been very, very good, but they didn't let LSU score. Georgia's defense has been a good notch worse than Alabama's, who's not perfect. And I think that's why you've been getting these results is they can't hold bad teams to few enough points that we do live in a modern world of football where you're going to have games where you score 25 because you don't have the RPO score 40 plus every outing if you're a high level team thing anymore. It doesn't exist. It's a lot more ground and pound. And again, even with Georgia being a top 10 team in points per drive, games are much shorter. It's hard to create that differentiation over time and build out a lead. And I think the opposite is definitely true of Texas. I mean, they're defensively they've been pretty good or very good for the most part. But then you go back and look at them, right? Defensively they're very good. They hold Ohio State to 14, but they only score 7. They hold Florida to 29, which was not good, but not awful, but they only score 21. Hold Kentucky to 13, you only score 16. I mean, that's been the story of a lot of these. And even Vanderbilt 34-31, as you said, it really wasn't that close. But Vanderbilt, it's an awesome offense. Mississippi State has a very good offense. Those are higher scoring games versus really low capability defenses in both cases. And so I think the sort of the yin and the yang of both of these teams has been a huge factor. The one thing is we maybe move into the prediction side of this, Daniel. There's a lot you can talk about with both teams and personnel. Georgia's defensive personnel in the front seven I think has gotten better. Texas is, I think, pretty good across the board. We have them third in rushing, 42nd in passing. Definitely, pass defense has been their issue through the course of the year. Georgia 17th, 30th is a lot more balanced. But the thing to me is Texas, I feel like, has figured some things out offensively on their weaker side of the ball and gotten more into form. They've figured out how to use Wingo. They've just across the board, right? Be it in the run game with getting Wisner going, kind of realizing maybe they shouldn't lean as much on Baxter as I think maybe they originally thought. Getting more involved, I feel like they've taken steps forward. Georgia's defense has been the issue, and now you have Kyron Jones who's injured indefinitely, and just across the board they've been banged up, they've been unsettled, they haven't been able to really figure the secondary out. I thought they were taking steps forward when they were starting to make changes at corner, and maybe they were going to really improve, and then that kind of all got blown up by this whole injury situation. And now they're right back where they were. And to me, that does give, if you're evaluating like Georgia versus Texas, it gives a lot of concern because I do wonder if Texas can repeat some of the success they had in the prior game of just getting the ball to their athletes in space, given that Georgia continues to be pretty unsettled in the back end of their defense.
So this is unscientific. Forgive me, but I think it's interesting. Texas and Georgia share 3 common opponents. Mississippi State, Kentucky, and Florida. In every one of those games, Georgia did both better as a pass defense against the opposing quarterback and better as a passing quarterback. So looking at Stockton's performance versus those 3 teams and Arch Manning's performance versus those 3 teams, in all 3 is a complete shutout. Is that a leading indicator of anything? We're trying to settle who Texas is before and after, but it looks like, they have a good pass defensive numbers, but they haven't faced good pass offenses. And when they have, I think Mississippi State is a good offense in general, but it's not almost 400 yards passing and 38 points like good against an elite defense or a great defense. Vanderbilt's got a good passing offense or a good offense in general, but 31 points ain't great. And I look back at the Oklahoma game, 23-6. But Mateer, as we mentioned in our recap, they've played 5 games this year, and Mateer has thrown for 5 games in the conference. Mateer has thrown for less than 6 yards an attempt in 3 of those 5 games. So we think of Oklahoma and Mateer because he came in with such high praise that was going to be an elite passing offense. It really it's actually been below SEC average passing offense. I wonder if this Texas defense is good but doesn't scale well against decent, not even great, but decent quarterbacks. Josh, is it fair to look at these 3 common opponents and just say, look, it's kind of a wash, or it's kind of, there's your story, and Georgia might not only win, but win a little comfortably?
I think there's probably something to it. I mean, you're focusing on pass defense in particular and passing offense, and I think there's probably an edge there. I mean, we have them 20th running the ball, 49th passing. They're definitely more comfortable running it, or at least want to stay balanced that way. But to your point, I mean, when you look at Texas's schedule, and this was their problem last year when they lost 2 games to Georgia, Georgia, from a talent perspective, is probably way ahead of everybody they played and beaten. I mean, Ohio State has more talent right now probably than Georgia. Just honestly speaking, in terms of guys on the field starting, a lot of it's because where Georgia's at in terms of roster turnover. Florida has a high talent team. Texas lost that game. I don't know, Daniel, that Oklahoma is a particularly high talent team. I think they play well. I think they've got a lot of good players on both sides of the ball, but I don't know that they have a lot of really, really high level draft pick type players.
Greater than the Vanderbilt sum of their parts, right?
Yeah, Vanderbilt is certainly better than some of their parts team. They do not have a lot of high draft pick players. Pavia is very good and has been very good in a college system. Stowers, the tight end, is probably the one guy that's a real standout that might go really high in the draft, I think. But Georgia stands out in comparison to those teams because on both sides of the ball, they've got impact, high-level athletic guys that those other teams just can't touch. And maybe those other teams are more complete in different ways. But the thing that struck me, when you watch the Vanderbilt-Texas game, is how much Vanderbilt really was struggling to deal with Texas's athleticism in space, and how Sark is really a genius at getting isolation. He's a true play calling guru. He just is. And they were able to scheme like Ryan Wingo in the opening play of the games. And in some ways, it's a simple swing pass, but they managed to get enough isolation that Wingo just blows by everybody. Vanderbilt, a team that had played pretty good defense and looks physical. If you make a physical guy run and try to tackle in a sprint, they never look physical. It's just the nature of, to some degree, like kinematics, but also just the nature of being an athlete. When you're straining to run and keep up with somebody in pass defense, trying to make a tackle in the open field, whatever, you're going to be awkward. And Vanderbilt's athletes were not good enough to really run with Texas, and they were constantly out of position. Much the same way Alabama's defense looked like trash against Florida State because they were out of position. Florida State has a lot of speed, and they're constantly trying to run and make a tackle at a sprint, and they look awful. And that's what Texas did to Vanderbilt. Georgia's athleticism is a completely different level. I mean, when you talk about C.J. Allen, K.J. Bolden, Raylan Wilson, I mean, those guys like Chris Cole, maybe they haven't always consistently played at the level people would hope, but they've been better and better as the season goes on. And there's no doubt athletically they're on a different planet than anything Texas has faced in the last few weeks. And, when you look, can I bring up the model, Daniel, at this point?
I'd love for you to bring up the model and give me your prediction.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the model favors Texas, 21.2 to 20.5 by about 0.7 of a point. Yardage, slight edge to Texas, thinks Georgia throws it a little better, thinks Texas runs it a little better. None of that, I think, is particularly surprising from a general where it's at from a yardage perspective or anything like that. But this is a game where Georgia's favored by 6.5. And so you start to sort of get the question of why is our model sort of incongruous? And the over-under is at 48. Our model's only saying about 42 points. And Daniel, I think what you can take from that's a couple things. One, I think you're noting something correctly about scaling issues. And to give an anecdote in an SEC video and take a shot at the Big Ten, which I think is a factual shot, but one they would probably get upset about. In net points per drive, right? So the points per drive you score on offense minus the points per drive you allow in defense. First in the country is Indiana. Third in the country is Oregon. And both those teams have had their struggles. We talked about in a recap, which you should watch. We talk about everything we can under the sun, but we had a lengthy discussion about sort of the silo or cluster that exists in the Big Ten. Indiana, Oregon, Iowa, Penn State, they've all played each other, and every one of those games has been close. But the thing is, Indiana and Oregon have destroyed the bad teams to such an extent that they end up being number 1 and number 3 in net points per drive, or like net scoring differential, even though all the good teams they play are close. And Daniel, like Texas isn't, they're 26. Georgia's 13th in net points per drive. But even Texas, I think, there's under the surface, there's a little bit of that there. And I think it doesn't show up necessarily in the stat sheet, but to your point on like recency bias with various aspects, when Texas has played bad defenses, the skill position talent is able to get the ball in space with enough space. And I always say this with modern offenses, they are designed in the spread and everything you can do with the RPO and whatnot, that if you have a significant talent and speed advantage, you can get them the ball in space and they can score you a lot of points fast. But those advantages in that scheme tends to really break down when you no longer have those advantages because you don't get the space when you catch the ball, and what is a screen that goes or a swing pass that goes 75 yards suddenly gets tackled for a loss or goes for two because the difference between the linebacker getting a hand on you is the difference between him pulling down the wide receiver who's undersized by 50 pounds or him going the distance for a touchdown. And ultimately, I think that like that again being 13th versus 26th in net points per drive over the course of the year probably ends up being kind of reflective of the differences. I think Georgia is just a slightly better team. I think the loss of Colby Young's been a pretty negative impact on their offense, but they figured out Bowens. They've got a pretty good rushing attack. Their offensive line has gotten, I think, significantly better over the course of the year, and they've got a balanced offense, but especially relying on Frazier, who's a good back, to make things happen. And I think Stockton has played very high level football. Even accepting that I think Arch Manning's played significantly better over the course of the year, I do also believe Gunnar Stockton is the better quarterback, frankly. And even though I think Texas has the better receivers, I just think Georgia as an overall unit, they're a little more physical, but they're also just more consistent. I think they have a better identity than Texas. I think defensively they're more sound than Texas, which again, run and pass, they're both better in our metrics. I'm going to take them 27-20, Daniel. Pretty consistent with Vegas, but that was my score in my head before. I do think Texas is more than capable of beating Georgia in this game. I think Georgia is maybe a notch better, frankly. They're favored for a reason. I do wonder if Georgia's secondary is going to be their Achilles heel again, and I think if they lose the game, it probably will be, to take away your final game thought. But ultimately, I just think Texas is going to show what we call scaling issues in that they're going to play a defense with significantly more size and speed than they have in many weeks. And I think a lot of the old problems you saw early in the year are going to creep back up because when the speed of the game speeds up, even though Arch Manning's done better, suddenly I think you're going to see some of those old problems creep up because it's really easy to use good mechanics when you have a clean pocket. It's really easy to break down and start trying to throw sidearm and do the things he did against Ohio State or Florida when you're getting a pass rush, and then you try to rush things, and I think that's where maybe stuff comes unglued a little bit.
So, do you have Texas's schedule up? All right, I have a quick question for you as we lead into my prediction. I guess exercise would be a better word for it. Can you give me, in your opinion, what the 3 or 4 worst games for Texas this year were?
I would say the worst games for Texas: Florida, Kentucky, and then I might actually say Mississippi State, Daniel. Because of how the defense played versus Ohio State, I don't think they're in that list, even though the offense was pretty bad.
So, there's something all of those games and their fourth game, Ohio State, have in common. They've all been away from home. Texas has gotten kind of screwed this year in that they're they have played one Power Four team at home this year, and it's going to be what, November 22nd before they play their second. That's insane to me, and that is part of the side effect of playing a neutral site game against your big rival. It takes away a home game every other year, and it's in a year where they're playing on the road in the home. They get the home turn of their home and home, I guess, next year with Ohio State. So I think that, there's something to be said here, 16-13 on the road versus Kentucky. 45-38 overtime versus Mississippi State. 14-7 Ohio State. Florida game they lost on the road. That Oklahoma game was not at home, but it's a split crowd. Georgia's going to be a completely different animal. Georgia is going to be way crazier than Ohio State game was, because that Ohio State game, I'm pretty sure, was a big noon kickoff game. I do think the Mississippi State, with this stupid rule exemption that they get for noise making, makes that a little tough place to play, maybe artificially. But this is something that is not being discussed very much, that night games in particular at Georgia have become a lot more hostile than they've been known for in the last few years. Arch Manning had Georgia at home last year, and then in Atlanta, I think it's a pretty interesting note. And I also think I don't like the transitive property thing as a one off. But if you take the three games that you have in common with the other team, Georgia beat Florida, could have beaten them by 2 scores, took a knee on the 1 yard line. Texas lost pretty comfortably to Florida. Georgia destroyed Kentucky. Texas went to overtime with Kentucky. Georgia destroyed Mississippi State. Texas went to overtime with Mississippi State. This I cannot ignore in such a way that I am picking a 31-17 win for Georgia. I don't do this a lot because we cover a lot of the biggest games. Those are always pretty close spreads. I don't go out on a limb, and the safe thing to say for me would be, it's a coin flip game, 24-21, Texas or Georgia. A few times a year I do this, and to me, there's not enough there for me to pick a Texas close game in this one. So 31-17 Georgia. Am I making sense at all?
I honestly, I think you are. I mean, these are totally different teams. There's going to be a lot of parallels made through the end of the year, and I'm sure we'll do a Texas A&M preview on where Texas was and how those games went and how close they were. I don't know if Georgia's better or worse than they were last year, Daniel, with Beck. I think they're probably better overall than they were to end the year because Beck was playing pretty bad football. And then Stockton, when he came in the playoff versus a very good Notre Dame defense, just wasn't ready. But there's no doubt that Texas is a completely different team, right? I mean, that we talked about with Ohio State and Texas in the opener. They were it was the first time in an opener you had two teams with over 20 draft picks between them ever. Most turnover between two teams in an opener in history. And there's just not a lot of reason to do parallels, but I do feel somewhat strongly, Daniel, that Texas is probably a worse team than they were a year ago. I think that's a pretty fair thing. They were very good a year ago, and there's been so many conversations with Texas fans about scheduling and other things. And again, anytime you have like social media, you're always hearing the loudest, whiniest minority voices. But the reality is that was kind of an almost generational Texas team, probably the best team they've had in like decade plus, really. And I think that skewed a lot of perception. And the reality for this schedule is it ended up being, a few good teams. Oklahoma win was a really big win, but, that was also a game where Mateer played really terribly. Vanderbilt was a good win, but close. Maybe not that close, but a good win. But Georgia and Texas A&M are kind of a different beast. And if it goes through this schedule and Texas is kind of who we think they are, I don't think it's insensible to say that they lose to Ohio State, they lose to Georgia, they lose to Texas A&M. You drop a stupid one to Florida. I mean, that is kind of where I think the general expectation is for them as a program. We'll see where Texas A&M is and where our preview is for that game when we get there. But just in a quality level for this team, they're just not the same level team that they were a year ago. Again, like FEI currently has Texas 17th. Last year, Texas was 5th. Offensively, Texas was 18th. Defensively, they were 3rd last year in FEI. This year, they're 37th and 10th. I mean, they're just not on the same level. And I don't know that Georgia is really any worse than they were a year ago. And if you put those two things together and every other data point you said, it all does suggest that Georgia's going to win this game.
And it is interesting because we compare Georgia's defense in any given year to who they were in 2021, 2022. And if they're not that, which nobody is, even Ohio State this year, I don't think, then we think they suck. So Texas scored 15 and 16 in the two games against Georgia last year. And that Georgia defense, I guess we're kind of feeling it was a lot better. Last year they were 23rd in scoring defense. This year they're 24th. They average less than a point giving up more this year than last year. They're kind of the same team, I think, just with better quarterback play. I'm comfortable with my pick. You got 27-20. Both of us have Georgia covering this one. Give me a 30-second parting shot because this is a long one.
The thing that I'll go back to is I do think injuries may be mounting up for Georgia, and I'm not sure how that's going to go because they've can Georgia's offensive line hold up has been a question for them the whole year. And if you're a Georgia fan, you're probably screaming at the ceiling as I say that. But the other question I think that's the big deal is, can Georgia play well enough on the perimeter versus Texas's skill guys. Because if you really look what Texas has done the past few weeks and where they've had the most success, yes, they've made some downfield throws and they've opened up things with Manning, but their bread and butter has really been just getting the ball quickly to guys in space, knowing they have really high level skill talent, and letting those guys eat a bit. Because when you've got guys like, Wingo and Moore and even like Wisner in space, those guys, Mosley, can create plays for you. And I think that last game versus Vanderbilt, I think they only had 2 plays over 20 yards, Daniel, rushing or passing in their 34 points. Most of it was short stuff going for first downs. And so I think the question for Georgia is, are they in a good enough spot to clamp down on that and make Texas play a more read-based intermediate game with balancing off the run, and that's where I think Texas gets uncomfortable. But I will say I think the thing that makes me the most comfortable with Georgia is I do feel like Georgia's offense is good enough, assuming the offensive line holds up, which, I don't assume anything versus Hill and Simmons. But I feel like Stockton has been good enough and the run game has been good enough that they're going to get their points, and it's just a matter of whether Texas can match it.
All right, y'all. Let us know what you think the score of this game is going to be. And Texas fans, let us know if we're being fair. Not so much about the score. You might disagree with us on that, but just in terms of our original Arch Manning observations, how we've kind of come around or been proven true on that, and whether or not you think we hate y'all. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.